good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you so much for being here today for this extremely timely webinar organized thanks to our partners at the Pacific Council on International Policy. My name is Jason Moyer. I'm an associate at the Wilson Center where I work on Nordic security, NATO, and all things transatlantic security. Today, we're going to be turning a little bit further north to polar politics. I'm delighted to be joined by two distinguished guests, two former ambassadors who have extensive careers in public service, as well as the private sector. I'd like to introduce, Ambassador Rufus Gifford, who was the U.S. ambassador to to he was the U.S. ambassador to Denmark from 2013 to 2017, and that also includes Greenland, which I'm sure we'll talk about today. And I'd also like to introduce Ambassador Marc Nathanson, who's the U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Norway from 2022 to 2024. So their full bios are available on the Pacific Council website. You shouldn't have any problems accessing those. To begin, I'd like to just kind of start by acknowledging that Greenland has been in the news a lot recently. Ambassador Gifford, I'll turn to you first. Could you talk us through what are some of the U.S. interests in Greenland? Has anything shifted recently that may be driving President Trump's recent interest in Greenland?
Sure. Jason, thank you so much. And just want to thank the Pacific Council for inviting us for, as you said, Jason, an extremely timely conversation. I think it's one of these issues, especially with Greenland constantly being in the media these last couple of months, where I do think it's critically important that we have a little perspective here, and that people understand that what we're talking about, this is not just about U.S. interests in the Arctic, as far as I'm concerned. It's also about the tactics with which the United States government conducts their foreign policy, and I just want to touch on both as we enter into this discussion. So the first thing is, and I'll take kind of a larger step back, as it relates to American interests in the Arctic, I do think we need to be paying more attention. Just to give you a little bit of historical perspective specifically about Greenland. So the United States used to have 17 military bases on Greenland, 17, 1-7, at the end of the Cold War. And so that was in 1945. Since then, there has been a dramatic scale back in the American military presence in Greenland. We now have one base left, which used to have thousands of soldiers stationed at it. It now has roughly around 200. So that just speaks to, as the United States has de-emphasized the Arctic after the end of the Cold War, while putting their attention on the other parts of the world, whether that was the Middle East or Southeast Asia, et cetera. What we've seen in recent years, though, is a significant military buildup, or the Russians and the Chinese take particular interest in that part of the world. And so, and of course, you've seen the threat of Russian expansionism, whatever you want to call it, with Crimea and Ukraine. So without a doubt, we need to be taking it more seriously. As it relates to the economic investment in the Arctic, and that includes things like shipping lanes, but also minerals, et cetera. I would also agree that we should be looking at the Arctic. That being said, we can't underestimate how challenging it is. It's extremely expensive. The elements are what they are. If ever anyone has ever been to Greenland, it is very it's a rough climate, to say the least. I've been there 9 times and spend lots of time engaging with the Greenlanders and how much they want to be partners with the United States. So very brief overview there. What I take enormous issue with, Jason, is Trump administration tactics here. It's less about wanting the United States to take this part of the world more seriously. I am on board with that. It is much more about this idea that you need to acquire Greenland in order to achieve that mission, and that is just simply misplaced in every way. Everything that Donald Trump says that he wants to achieve, what JD Vance said, what the vice president said when he was at Patuxent Air Base, which is our last remaining base on Greenland, can and would be achieved if you engage the Danes and the Greenlanders in the respectful way in which allies should be engaged. Across the table, negotiate, and they would love nothing more for the United States to continue to invest militarily in Greenland, and certainly for the American private sector to invest in Greenland. When I was ambassador, we looked at that. We constantly tried to get U.S. investment in Greenland, and with some success, but not as much as we'd like. And certainly we could do more and more and more to be looking to that part of the world. So it's a very, very complex dynamic. We could talk about independence and what the Greenlanders want, what the Danes want, but generally speaking, you cannot divorce this, Jason, from the fact that the Danes say Greenland is not for sale. Most importantly, the Greenlanders say Greenland is not for sale. So let's take that off the table, please. Let's take this off the table and engage our allies in the manner in which they deserve to be engaged. And let's grow a robust and strong relationship between the United States and the people of Greenland, while maintaining, of course, one of the best and most reliable allies that we have on the planet, which is Denmark. And what's happening now, I think, is just really upsetting so many of those very, very, very vital and fundamental parts of America, historically American foreign and national security policy. So that's my basic sort of 5 minute version of Greenland, and I'm happy to talk obviously a lot more about the details and everything in between.
Thank you, Ambassador Gifford. And just to kind of follow up, you had a viral video that went out a few days ago where you highlighted Denmark's considerable contributions to U.S. military activities around the world. Could you say just a few words about just kind of some of the top line takeaways from that video?
Sure. And this is something I do think Americans need to speak out on this. And I think it's really important because my challenge with Trump administration foreign policy, I have a number of challenges, but the most important thing too is that these alliances, and let's remember where we are. The last 80 years have been the most peaceful and prosperous in the history of the West. And that is in large part because of not to be oversimplistic here, an all for one and one for all approach between the United States and Europe. And that essentially the two largest economic zones in the country, the United States and Europe, together with NATO, I didn't even mention NATO as it relates to Greenland, couldn't be any more vital. But those alliances have countered other threats from around the world. And I think that to weaken those in any way are enormously challenged. But what I said in the videos that have like kind of wonderfully gone viral, I think, is that I mean, you can't forget that Denmark, I was the guy that would go to the prime minister or the foreign minister, and Mark has done the same, of course, and ask them to send their special forces to Iraq to fight ISIS, to remove chemical weapons from Syria, to fight Ebola in Africa. And they, without hesitation, the Danes said yes every single time. And in large part, and not in large part, I mean, this was in their national security interest, we believe as well. But if the United States asks, they say yes because of our moral standing in their eyes, our moral standing in the world. And I think when you treat and don't, the Danes lost more people per capita in Afghanistan than any country other than the US. That's also vitally important. So when you treat an ally with the level of disrespect that the president and vice president are treating them right now, you can't help but feel like this is a kick to the gut in some of these allies that have just been there for us for as long as the Danes have been there for us. And it's not just, and I think too much is made on it, not too much, but a lot is made of the economic and the political fallout here. What I am most worried about, Jason, is the human fallout. As we all, Mark knows this too, the cultural connections between Danes and Americans couldn't be any stronger. They study in the United States. They love traveling to the United States. They proudly our culture, all of it. And this is now all challenged. And and I believe that a geopolitically isolated United States of America, which is what we're heading, don't get me started on tariffs. Like we didn't even talk about tariffs, the news of the last 12 hours. But this is going to be a weakened United States of America. And that's what I worry about. Why not embrace our best allies in the world and still accomplish the mission that you intend to accomplish, going back to Greenland, of course?
Thank you so much. Ambassador Nathanson, there's been a lot of mischaracterizations about the Arctic in the media lately. Can you help kind of set the record straight and give us a broader context of the importance of the Arctic region? What other kind of key countries and stakeholders have interests in it? And especially given your time in Norway, for a long time, Norway has been the herald of all things Arctic within NATO. How this is being perceived within Norway and among leaders there?
Thank you, Jason. The Arctic is critical to the world. Just as an example, in Norway, which borders Russia, the Arctic Council is made up of the United States, Canada, uh, obviously Denmark, and the other Nordic countries, as well as Russia. But in recent years, after the invasion in Ukraine, Russia has been asked not to participate. And if you look at a map of the world and you look down, the United States is very close to not only Greenland and Norway, but to the other Arctic countries, as well as Russia, because of the proximity to the Arctic. The Arctic is critical not only for strategic and military reasons, but also because the ice is melting, the climate is changing. The Chinese are very interested in shipping there. And I think we have to focus very much as Americans, and Americans in this case, in my case, living in California, on the Arctic and what is going on in the Arctic. And let me say, and Rufus alluded to this, the Arctic and the discussion about the Arctic is not new. It's not new to the Trump administration. It was also focused on by previous administrations. I had many meetings in 2022 with then Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Derek Chollet about the Arctic, and they agreed that we could put a consul, an American presence post in the Arctic, which we did in October of 23, just to show you the emphasis and the importance of the future of the Arctic. Precious minerals, also another factor, but I want to emphasize again how important the Arctic is and Norway's role there, because the Arctic and Norway are very synonymous. Norway through Svalbard is only 600 miles from the North Pole. It's even closer than Greenland, which is less than 1,000 miles. So we can't just talk about Greenland isolated. We have to look at the whole Nordics, which include Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and of course, Iceland. Very critical.
Great. Thank you so much. So turning to the elephant in the room, Russia is the largest Arctic state, and the region's a top priority for Russian leadership in terms of economic and military significance. This is a question to both of you. Can you tell us a little bit more about Russia's interests in the Arctic? Maybe Ambassador Gifford, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think that, I don't want to, this sounds a little dramatic, but I think that we've been a bit asleep at the wheel vis-a-vis countering Russia as they have been building up their Arctic military presence in a significant way since the end of the Cold War. As we have tried to, I think, and it really wasn't. I will tell you, as I was preparing for, we go to what we call ambassador school, the seminar essentially every incoming ambassador has to go through. And during my training, there really, because it was before Crimea, and it was at the time, the attempt was to actually try to engage Russia in a very different way than the geopolitical climate. Well, again, before Crimea. And Putin, Russia was still in the G8 at the time, etc. So to counter Russia in the Arctic wasn't considered to be American policy, and this wasn't even a partisan thing. This, whether it's Obama or Bush, Clinton, etc. then I think what we saw was a heightened Putin aggression. And at that point, we took it more seriously. But of course, anything, all costs associated with investing in this part of the world. I mean, it is extraordinarily expensive. What they now with Patufic, which is used to be called Thule when I was there, was the most expensive military base in the world to maintain at the time. I don't know if it still is. And so my point here is that the cost, American military in essence, did a cost benefit analysis in essence and deprioritize the Arctic. I think that without a doubt, we have to match Russia and Chinese interest in this part of the world. But I will say this, that think about it. I mean, Mark mentioned the Arctic Council. And if you look at the Canadians, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Americans, in addition, of course, to Iceland, Finland, and Sweden, they don't border the Arctic Ocean, but also Arctic nations and important. This should be an extraordinarily strong alliance. Every one of those countries is NATO. Every one of those islands, those countries, if we speak with one voice, can absolutely counter Russia. So yes, I mean they are an adversary. We need to take them seriously. But again, I do think both bilaterally and multilaterally as Arctic Council nations and all NATO allies, it's absolutely vital to take seriously.
Ambassador Nathanson, especially given Norway does share a border with Russia in the Arctic.
Yeah, no question. And as Rufus knows, Denmark signed a U.S. supplemental defense treaty with the United States in 1951. Norway has similar treaties. Both Denmark and Norway were original members of NATO. The difference is Norway does not allow any foreign bases on its soil. However, we must really make everyone aware we rely totally, the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence agencies, on the very robust intelligence gathering by the Norwegians in what they call the High North. And we rely totally on that. And we do many military exercises there. They're not permanent exercises, but American troops, British troops, French troops, etc., participate in NATO exercises in Norway, in the Arctic area of Norway. But it's absolutely vital to the United States interest of Norway's sharing their intelligence about the Second Fleet, the Russian Second Fleet, the movement of nuclear submarines by Russia, what's going on in that area. And I feel it's very important for relations between the United States and the Nordic countries to be on a very positive basis. And as Rufus said, the Norwegians, the Danes, others tend to love the United States. There's more than 1 million Americans with Norwegian ancestry in the Midwest, etc. So there's a very fondness toward the United States since the end of World War II. I hope that does not deteriorate because of what's going on right now.
The other elephant in the room is, of course, China and China's interest in the Arctic. It's important to note that China is far away from the Arctic region, although it has declared itself a near Arctic state. Its presence so far is largely focused on scientific research, some economic investments, especially in Russia, some limited commercial shipping, as well as an annual icebreaker expedition that supports scientific missions. So my question to you both, why is China interested in the Arctic? What are the top concerns and implications from a U.S. perspective? Ambassador Nathanson, I'll start with you.
Yeah, first of all, they do have scientific facilities in Norway, which they're entitled to do, particularly in Svalbard because of the 1925 treaty, which allows members who signed that treaty, 50 nations, to do that, and it's a non-military zone. But in my opinion, I wouldn't count all those scientific facilities to be purely scientific and not gathering military intelligence. Why? China is very interested in the Arctic and in shipping. With the ice melting, if you can bring ships from Asia to Europe, it takes less than 7 days versus going through the Suez Canal or other routes. So China sees that as a big plus to have shipping routes as the ice is melting. It's, in my opinion, a great tragedy, and I think this is going to be rectified by the Trump administration, that the United States has one very old icebreaker still working, and both the Chinese and the Russians have an enormous fleet of icebreakers that are operating and can operate in the Arctic area. And as Rufus said, I think we, the United States, and I support the Trump administration's focus on the Arctic. But I agree with Rufus, it has to be done in a much more peaceful, diplomatic way.
On China, Jason, yeah, I agree obviously with everything Mark said. I think, but it's also I think the history here is also a little interesting. I mentioned that Russia, when I was going through ambassador training in 2013, Russia was deprioritized as a threat sort of in the Arctic, and there was a sort of very much an attempt to embrace them as Arctic Council members. There was real Chinese skepticism at the time, however. At the time, the Chinese were making huge investments in Iceland, mostly through real estate, etc. And there was a fear that that would sort of that would head to Greenland. The Chinese were the first country in the world that had a consulate in Nuuk, in the capital of Greenland. The U.S. is the second, so they were taking great interest in the Arctic at the time. My understanding, and remember, I left 8 years ago, so I don't have the same access to the kind of intelligence that I would have had back then. But my understanding is the Chinese, based on a number of different things, have actually looked less at investment in some of these Arctic countries. It's not that they don't care, they do, and certainly, and they have had some success mining in Greenland. They would like to have more. Again, remember, when you open up a new mine in Greenland, it's not as if there's an airport close by in a town where people can live and a harbor for your ships to dock. You have to build everything from scratch, everything, and bring everything in. Build a landing strip, build a harbor, build housing, and bring every single person in. And so there's obviously a huge cost associated with that. And some countries have, the Australians, the Chinese have looked very closely at it with different, I think there's been some success, but some enormous challenges associated with any sort of economic success. I will say in closing though, Jason, one of my biggest fears here is this, and by the way, Mark mentioned shipping lanes and whatnot. That's very, very important here. I think the Chinese are certainly interested in with the icebreakers, et cetera, in dominance as it relates to shipping in that part of the world. This is my biggest fear, especially with the United States kind of stepping back from a global leadership position intentionally, would be obviously, in my mind, China is an economic adversary, Russia's a military adversary. That partnership, especially in the Arctic, is really scary, I think, for Americans, and should be. They are both, I think Russia's not a particular threat economically. I don't know that China may be an increasing threat militarily, but not quite the same as Russia. But that partnership is something that we absolutely need to take very, very seriously.
In terms of what should be the top priority for U.S. foreign policy, would you say it should be more focused on China or Russia? Ambassador Gifford and then Ambassador Nathanson.
I just think the tactics have to be slightly different. I think to counter, it's I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify this, and I'm in no way a China expert, but I think it's really economic dominance that China is interested in, and Putin is and then again, this is wildly oversimplified, and I think Putin in to counter that is actually much more interested in kind of older Soviet dominance. And there's something very modern about the Chinese approach. There's something very old-fashioned in some ways about Putin's approach. But I think both have to be countered. I just think you have to counter them differently. Yeah, I mean, and we could talk about various ways to do that. I think it's hard. I mean, I think it's hard to make the argument that Putin is not more empowered at the moment. China, again, you'd have to have someone to really be a China expert to weigh on exactly how they're going to manage tariffs and the various any sort of trade war and who comes out on top there. I can't imagine it's us, but I think that they're both adversaries. I think they both have to be taken seriously, but I think the way you address them is very different.
Yeah, and let me say, at a different time when I went to charm school, Russia was really, quote, the enemy because of Crimea originally, and then Ukraine, where China, at least under the Biden administration, there was more outreach. As ambassador, we did not participate or invite the Russians to any activities where we did with the Chinese. However, that being said, the Chinese, at least as far as Finland and Norway are concerned, tried to make economic inroads by buying various infrastructure in that area. And with urging from the United States, the Norwegians and the Finns blocked that from happening. So the Chinese ability to buy ports and other infrastructures were not successful in Norway and later in Finland. And I think that is a good thing, but the Chinese are certainly there, are interested in the Arctic. But as Rufus said, the whole relationship with Russia and the Arctic is completely different. And as Jason, you indicated, Russia is the largest Arctic nation with Siberia, besides all their military activity. But I want to point out that a lot of the mineral development, both fossil fuel and other, in Russia were joint ventures with Western companies, and all the Western companies, including the Norwegian companies, pulled out. And it was their expertise that was used. So will the Chinese step into those activities? That remains to be seen.
I think Mark makes an important point here, Jason, which I'll weigh in on too. It's that some of the Chinese charm offensive has not necessarily gone particularly well in the Nordic countries. So, and that's one of the reasons why I mentioned that they were looking very aggressively at the Nordic countries for a long time. Like Mark mentions that the Norwegians and the Finns were skeptical of Chinese investment. The Danes are as well. There's just skepticism associated with larger Chinese investment broadly.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for adding that in. And as you mentioned, there is a lot of skepticism about China, in particular when it comes to human rights abuses. That's really kind of promulgated in Nordic and the various Nordic countries' media. I have one more question, but I do want to remind the audience that's watching that you can submit questions to our two fantastic speakers using the Q&A button on Zoom. My final question that comes from me specifically. What are some of the challenges that the U.S. faces in the Arctic? Ambassador Nathanson, you've already alluded to the significant icebreaker shortage that we have. And what are some potential ways that we can overcome these challenges? Ambassador Gifford, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched, Jason, on most of the things that I think need to happen. But I will say, I think that sometimes I think, and one of my frustrations with the rhetoric associated with the foreign policy of this administration right now is just simply the simplistic nature in which they address huge problems. It's like, for example, Greenland, again, I didn't mention this, but there's this kind of sense that Greenlandic independence, the Greenlandic independence movement would lead Greenlanders into the waiting arms of the United States, and thus want to become an American territory. It's a truly ridiculous political argument, meaning. I mean, just put yourself in the Greenlandic, and I'm getting to the answer to your question, but just put yourselves in the position of a Greenlander. They have been fighting for independence for hundreds of years from a colonial power, and they finally achieve independence through a political process which is complex, etc. And now they're going to be taken over as a colony of another larger, colonial power in essence. It just doesn't make any logical sense. When you talk to a Greenlander, what they want, and I think the U.S. media gets this completely wrong. Greenlanders do not want to be, they want to be Iceland. They don't want to be Guam. And I think it's actually really important to think about it that way. When you talk to Greenlanders, and I've talked to hundreds of them literally, they talk about tourism in Iceland from the United States. They talk about trade that the Icelandic people, and similar to the trade, say, for example, Mark, with salmon in Norway or seafood, etc. The Greenlanders would love that. And it's more complicated. So I say all this, Jason, as a way to answer your question here, where the United States can continue to build up these political relationships in the Arctic is to make some of those, political investments, meaning actually bring a country like Greenland, if it does achieve independence, I honestly am not putting my finger on the scale as to whether or not that should happen. It doesn't make logical sense today, because they don't have a financial means in order to support themselves. They don't have the financial means in order to support themselves. Thus, some of these trading relationships they could really benefit from. So the United States could bring Greenland very, very close and have a really robust relationship, everything from trade to tourism, etc. I live in Boston. The flight from Boston to Nuuk is shorter than Boston to Miami probably. So it's extraordinary. If any of you have ever been on this call, have been to Greenland, it is the most extraordinary place I've ever been to in my entire life, and I don't believe that will ever change because it is amazing. So I do think we can do all of that work. As it relates to the military investment, I think we've really covered that. But I do think we should be thinking about this part of the world, respecting who they are, respecting their culture, respecting their interests, and it will end up being mutually beneficial, both politically, militarily, and economically.
I'd like to add, besides the business and trade in Greenland and the military, even though both Denmark and Norway are major buyers of U.S. military equipment, including F-35s, planes from Lockheed. Norway spends on average of $5 billion a year buying U.S. military equipment. So they are a major purchaser, and both Denmark and Norway are very wealthy countries, and we should point that out. But as far as Greenland is concerned, in the Arctic or the high north in Norway, what I think we need to focus on, besides trade and besides military and sharing military intelligence and building up our military activities as far as NATO is concerned in the United States in these areas, I think we need to do much more in the area of education. I had the great opportunity to visit and lecture, and I'm sure Rufus did as well, to universities throughout Norway, but particularly in the Arctic. They are eager for more exchange programs, more students, more studying of what is going on. Just as he mentioned, Greenland being a fabulous place, I would urge all the listeners on this call to visit Norway, and particularly Svalbard, which is a little archipelago of 9 little islands, but they have a great university there. And if you want to study the climate and what's going on with the climate, which is melting 4 times faster than anywhere else on Earth, I urge you as a tourist to go visit this part of the world and see for yourself what is going on. But I think student exchange programs, which used to be very robust, and I'm concerned that many foreign students now, as Rufus indicated earlier, may be hesitant about going to the United States to graduate school or undergraduate school because of the climate between the two countries, and instead will go to Scotland or England or other places. And I think that's a real tragedy for the United States.
Fully agree on all counts. Questions are streaming in from our active audience. As a reminder, you can still submit questions at any time as they pop up.
Well, while we're getting to those questions, Jason, just to comment, because Mark reminded me of something too on the F-35s and the military relationship, but the bilateral military relationships between our countries, and every embassy has something called the ODC, the Office of Defense Cooperation, which essentially advocates for the country and any NATO ally, as both Norway and Denmark are inclined to buy American weapons. And I helped sell the F-35 to the Danes as well. And just to show you kind of the direct financial impact of the current political climate in the United States, is that a very conservative Danish politician, who was one of the chief negotiators of the F-35 deal, which we helped with, named Rasmus Jarlof, he is looking actively as to whether or not Denmark can actually pull out of the F-35 deal. Largely based on what Trump said in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago, which was, we're going to still sell American weapons to our allies, but we don't know if they're going to be allies for very much longer, so they're not going to be as good. They're going to be 10% worse. And I can tell you, if I was the CEO of Lockheed Martin, I literally would have buried my head in the sand, because these are billions and billions of dollars of contracts that the Chinese are pulling out of, the Canadians are looking at pulling out of, and it's a huge loss to the American private sector when you say things like that.
Yeah, I think Portugal is actively considering whether it can pause its acquisition of the F-35s. It's having profound implications across the defense industrial space. I know there's been a push for the EU and some of the funding that's been unlocked through the EU, which doesn't impact Norway, but Denmark had this landmark referendum to opt into EU defense projects. There's been this funding that's been earmarked for buying European. Could you talk a little bit more about, kind of this push to prop up more of the European defense industrial base, and especially to rely less on foreign sources for their arms, to the extent that you?
Yeah. I'll speak to this, but I'll do it tangentially, because when I was there, American weapons were the bread and butter. I mean, they would have sort of scoffed at American any European weapon in favor of American weapons. I think that, so the fighter jet, just the Danes they're fantastic pilots, as the Norwegians are. They had a nice fleet of F-16s. F-16s are aging, so they put essentially a bid out for new fighter jets. They got 2 bids from Americans, Lockheed and Boeing, and then they got 2 European bidders, Swedish Gripen and the French Eurofighter. The 2 that they rejected first were the Swedish and French options, and then the finalists were Boeing and Lockheed, and Lockheed with the F-35 ended up winning. It is, I will say, Jason, if I had $1 million to invest right now, I would invest in European defense stocks. Only because I do think that our European allies are going to be looking very actively at European defense, and they're going to be like, I would make the argument that a lot of Trump administration folks would say that's good, and I'm thrilled. Let me just say this: I am thrilled that European countries are investing more in defense. I wish they were buying American weapons, because I think they're superior, but I think it doesn't. The Danish argument about pulling out of F-35 was, what's to prevent the Trump administration from holding these weapons hostage if we don't give them Greenland? And it's hard to push back on that. So I think that it is a complicated political dynamic that exists right now. Again, I'm not on the front lines of it anymore, but I would imagine it's a lot harder to be the Boeing and Lockheed rep. And now we're not just talking about fighter planes, right? We're talking about infrared goggles, and we're talking about bullets, and we're talking about all of the kind of various armory that goes into every element of the Danish military, and so much of that historically has been American. And I think that they're going to think twice in the future.
Yeah, and Denmark even used, their extensive experience with fighter jets to help train Ukrainian pilots at bases in Denmark. Excuse me. So really, it just goes to show how much of an impact that these acquiring these systems when they did, have played out in real time in Ukraine and elsewhere in European security.
Yeah, and remember, and we do, like, the U.S. military trains their pilots, and I think one of the things that, and Mark alluded to this too with education, but it's really important. In essence, one of the beautiful things about the last 80 years of transatlantic history is that so many, Mark, I'm sure you had the same experience. Some of the most moving interactions that I've had with Danes is people, saying they spent a year in Kentucky or Oklahoma, states that I've spent no more than than a couple of days in, maybe if I'm lucky. And they just said it changed their life and, brought so much funness, and they love the United States, and they keep in touch with their host families. And there's so much richness between these cultures. Same with the military. The Danish fighter pilots were all trained by Americans because they were flying F-16s, and they were all, they had nothing but fondness for the U.S. military. And that partnership it's richer than any political leader. It's richer than any, and I just think that is what's threatened right now, and that's what scares me.
No, I agree, Jason, with Rufus. When I was in Norway, half of the existing cabinet at that time had been to school either as a high school student on exchange program in Oklahoma or wherever. Half of them were there, and the other half went to graduate school at some American university. They're very, very much wedded and pro-American, and I'm very concerned that is changing. And I'm going to see soon when I visit Oslo again in early June to see what are the attitudes, because the Norwegians, including the king, who lived, if any of you saw Atlantic Crossing years ago on PBS, the king and his mother and two sisters, he was then a child, lived with Roosevelt in the White House during World War II, while his father and grandfather, the then king, were in England. So there's a long history of the Nordics and relationship, very positive relationships toward the United States. And I hope that isn't changing.
Thank you. We're getting questions now, fast and furious, from our audience. So just to dive into a few, and I'm going to bundle some of these, and some of these we're going to kind of make it so that both of our speakers can respond. We're getting a lot of questions about Greenland, as I'm sure you can imagine. But just to kind of start, is there a growing militarization of the Arctic happening now? There's some folks that are saying that there's this active kind of military buildup, but others say that actually it's very consistent with the levels that we've currently seen. Russia certainly is focusing a lot of its attentions on Ukraine and isn't spending quite what it used to in the Arctic. It's hard to get exact figures on those sorts of things. And what are kind of the global efforts that are happening to maintain the Arctic as a zone of peace? So is there a militarization happening, and is it still this zone of peace?
In Norway, I can't go into much detail, even though I've been out of government for over a year. But the Norwegians, as a member of NATO and as part of NATO, and we worked very hard to get Sweden and Finland to join NATO, are very much focused on the Arctic, particularly with those other two countries, as well as Denmark and Iceland. Iceland has no military. So Iceland is relying on the other Nordic and NATO nations. So there is a lot of focus on the military, but remember, the Arctic Council is non-military. The Archipelago that I mentioned in Svalbard is totally non-military. So I would say that there is a robust focus on the Arctic, particularly by the Norwegian intelligence agency, which is part of the military. I don't know about Denmark, Rufus.
Yeah, you're seeing that you're seeing the Danes invest pretty aggressively in Greenland right now. In um, one, for all the reasons Mark just mentioned, and two, because I think as part, at least as certainly as part of a response to Trump administration pressure here. So, and I think that's largely a good thing. I do. It is. I think one of the things that what frustrates me in hearing some of the Trump administration officials talk about how Denmark hasn't invested enough. Well, that's like saying that why haven't the Japanese and South Koreans invested more? I mean, it's like part of it is because the United States essentially said, we got this, please don't do it for a while, right? So my point is that at some point when you're punishing one of your great allies for something you did, whether or not it's a different administration or a different political party, it doesn't really matter. But it was part of the relationship between the two countries, and so I just think that so yes, I do think the Danes are going to be investing more in the Arctic. I think the Americans will too, and hopefully we can do this as partners. Yeah, I don't know. I think the point is real as to whether or not there's going to be a true militarization of the Arctic. I don't know. I think it's hard to say that right now. To the point of like lots of resources are going to Ukraine. Well, lots of Danish resources are going to Ukraine too, and a lot of Europe is focused on Ukraine, as they should be, as far as I'm concerned. So it certainly is not dominant in the European psyche at the moment.
Thank you both. I think, yeah, this is where we're seeing the media talk about the militarization of the Arctic. And it's like, I don't think that there's actually kind of as much there as they would lead you to believe.
Well, and it's actually sort of interesting, Jason, to build on that too. It's when the vice president was in Greenland last week, he was asked, "Do you have plans to build more military bases in Greenland?" And he said, "No, but we want to do things like icebreakers." I'm like, okay. I mean, that's great, but why do you need why do you need Greenland then? If you're not going to build more bases, I just don't. I don't. You're gonna. It doesn't make that part doesn't make logical sense. It didn't sound to me like the vice president had a plan to build up the American military presence in the Arctic. So, but who knows? Obviously don't know that for one way or the other.
We got a great question. What are the implications for NATO given our approach to Greenland? We have this really unprecedented move where U.S. administration is threatening to, or has alluded they wouldn't take invading off the table to a NATO ally or NATO territory.
I would say this. So I think this is NATO's worst nightmare, honestly. Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, tried to be diplomatic after his Oval Office meeting and his sort of press tour after that Oval Office meeting as to the NATO's involvement in this. Trump tried to bring him into it in the Oval Office, if people saw that, and he very much kind of changed the subject to say it politely. This is, I mean, there's lots of talk, and I've done a whole bunch of just sort of individual research and reading about this, because what would happen, one, I will say it on the record, I think the odds that Donald Trump sends the US military to take over Greenland is very, very, very slim. So that is my belief. Again, I am not inside Donald Trump's head, nor do I want to be, but that I cannot imagine that ends up happening. I think that what the larger issue, I think NATO would have to, NATO, you would think if that were to happen, which I think is the essence of the question, would Article 5 be invoked? And the truth of the matter is the US would block Article 5 from being invoked because NATO is an entity that requires unanimity. So I think the larger issue would likely be that a European defense clause would be invoked and thus compel some of the European nations to come to Greenland's defense. But again, I mean, that is literally the worst case scenario for every country except for Russia and China. So it just simply cannot happen. And so I think NATO is in a very difficult position here because the United States is a huge, I mean, we are by far the most important NATO country. So they're in a tough position, generally speaking.
Ambassador Nathanson, how has this been viewed in Norway? What have
I totally agree with what Rufus said. This would be a nightmare for the Nordics. This would be the worst possible thing to happen. Again, if we want to have more activity with Greenland, with other Nordic countries, particularly in the Arctic area, it's trade, it's joint ventures, it's military exercises, but an invasion, it would be a disaster.
Yeah, and then you mentioned these kind of economic ties. We had the tariffs go into place as of yesterday. It's still very much breaking news. What have been some of the initial reactions that you've been seeing in the countries you were assigned to? How have they been receiving this news?
Take that first, Mark. Yeah.
No, let me just say that I read the Norwegian papers, and the reaction is not positive toward the tariffs, to say the least. But the Norwegian government, which is typical, I think, of all the Nordics, is very cautious in what they're saying and what they're doing. And they see the United States, as a major trading partner. The two largest buyers of salmon, which is the largest fish export from Norway, and by the way, they're the largest salmon exporter in the world, are China and the United States.
Yeah, I think obviously I think the EU is anticipating this tariff. So the president imposed a 20% tariff on the EU yesterday, which is actually I was actually looking to see if Greenland was singled out because they're actually not EU, which is just a strange kind of personal thing. So I don't know if there's a Greenlandic tariff. I don't know if the Trump administration knows that they're not EU. I would assume that means that there's a 10% tariff on Greenland and a 20% tariff on mainland Denmark. But I don't really know. I think one of the leading indicators of European stocks is a company called Maersk, which is a shipping company, and it's Danish. It was way down today, which was it's for obvious reasons because they're a shipping company is reliant on trade, and I think that's going to be. And Denmark is a free trade nation because they have to be. They're too small, and they have great products, but they're too small to in order to they're a free trading nation. I'll just leave it at that. So I think there's great skepticism about American tariffs.
Jason, Rufus brings up a very important point. Both Denmark and Norway, Sweden a little different, but Finland as well, are very small countries population-wise, 5 to 6 million people in these countries, and we have to remember that. So trade is very important to these size countries, and the United States is the major trading partner. Norway is also not a member of the EU, but there were 15% tariffs placed on Norway yesterday.
Yeah. And what do you think is going to be kind of the fallout of these tariffs? Do you see countries buying more goods from China or elsewhere. I was really struck when I was last in northern Norway last summer. There were Chinese electric vehicles everywhere. It was really quite striking.
Well, you know, if you go to Brazil, for example, which has nothing to do with our conversation, the #1 car is a Chinese electric vehicle, which is much cheaper than the American electric vehicle or any electric vehicle assembled in Brazil. So there's a huge market, not in this country because of tariffs, but for Chinese cars in these other nations.
I'll add on to what Mark was saying here. I think that one, I think this was true with Norway too. I mean, the #1 car in Denmark for a long time was an American company called, if some folks may have heard of it, it's called Tesla. And let's just say it's no longer the #1 car company in the Nordics. But it was all back in the day. I hosted Elon when I was ambassador because of how important the Nordic countries were to Tesla's larger growth plan. But everything has changed right now. Everything has changed, especially in that part of the world. Every time I landed at the airport in Norway, in Oslo, Mark, I was picked up by a Tesla long before there were Tesla taxis here. But it seems like every Tesla, every taxi in Oslo is a Tesla.
No question about it. And I also hosted Elon in Norway because 70% of all the cars in Norway are Tesla and so forth. And it's a huge market for them, but sales have gone way down recently.
Jason, the other part of your question, though, it's like, is this empowering China and India? So I was back in Copenhagen a couple of months ago and giving a speech to the Danish Energy Export Council. And I think this wasn't directly about tariffs because tariffs hadn't hit yet. There was some anticipation of them, of course, but they were less concerned about tariffs. They were more concerned about sort of the larger trade policy, his kind of war on renewable energy. And so these are extraordinarily successful companies that a lot of you may have heard of. It's, Vestas, which is the largest maker of windmills, and a company called Ørsted, which is and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners that are very much investing in things like in wind, both onshore and offshore. And they are, I'd say, again, I don't know what they're doing today, but I think there is a real concern that the U.S. market is just not going to be there for them going forward, and that they're going to be looking towards places like China and India. And I think that is just so depressing. And again, this is actually not, I mean, for example, just offshore wind generally, there are going to be components that are impacted by tariffs, but the manufacturing of windmills is largely domestic because they're too big. Like to ship them across, you ship those turbines across the Pacific or something, it would be extraordinarily expensive. So a lot of these components are actually built locally because of cost, actually. So it's less about tariffs, but there's lots of policies that I think are going to be complicating and Norway, of course, is a huge export market as well, energy export market, and I think that you're going to see impact there.
A lot of the conversations I'm having with European colleagues, they're highlighting that the trust is no longer there between the United States and Europe. How do we go about rebuilding that trust, whether it's in the current moment, where kind of the bright spots that you're seeing in the transatlantic relationship, even if there's only a few, and really kind of looking ahead to the future? How do we build back this trust?
It's complicated, but I do say in my experience in talking to the future Norwegian ambassador that Trump has appointed, who has not been through Senate confirmation, but is a partner at the law firm of White and Case. He seemed very reasonable, very educated, very knowledgeable, and I don't know how much latitude he will have or not have with the State Department, but I was very comfortable with my conversations with him as I was with the first Trump ambassador who preceded me in Norway. So I think a lot will depend on, Jason, who it is and what their attitude is. But there is limitations that ambassadors have on foreign policy compared to what they are told by the State Department.
Yeah, I think this is a hard one, Jason, but I think it's vital. And I think, one of the things that I always said when I was ambassador to Danish people, not the politicians and the CEOs necessarily, but that, what has brought us through tough times in any bilateral relationship, and I frankly say that this time is tougher than anything we've seen, certainly since the end of the war, is the human connection, the cultural connection, the fondness between our citizens. And that has allowed us, it's allowed us. The Iraq War was extremely unpopular in Denmark, right? George W. Bush in his second term was extraordinarily unpopular in Denmark. Obviously, we were able to, that nothing changed fundamentally with the relationship. And it didn't matter that a president was unpopular or popular, because I believe that the cultural fondness between our countries matters so much. But the difference between, say, the Bush administration and the Iraq policy is that never did they, as citizens, feel disrespected. And now it's the average European that feels disrespected, not just the political leaders. And I think that is much harder to build back. And I think the answer to this, and this is why I think everybody on this call and so many of us have a responsibility here. This will fall on the shoulders of Americans to help try to convince our partners that we still value everything that they have done to make the world peaceful and prosperous for the last 80 years. I don't know exactly how to do that. I do my little part here as much as I possibly can. Yeah, but it's not easy. And I know, if you get outreach from Europeans right now, it's pretty grim. And I know that the president and vice president they say this, that they don't care very much about that. But I think some of us feel like we need to.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I'm sure we'll continue this conversation in other ways. Thank you again to the Pacific Council for inviting us to speak. Thank you again to Ambassador Nathanson, Ambassador Gifford, for sharing your insights during these truly unprecedented times.
Thank you, Jason. And Mark, wonderful to do this with you. It's great to see you, my friend.
Always, my friend Rufus.